You are listening to Radio Maria Canada. We now present the Health Hub, hosted by Cathy Biase.
Welcome to the Health Hub on Radio Maria Canada, exploring cutting-edge health and wellness, information, and therapies, helping you to take your health to the next level. I'm your host, Cathy Biase, and I'm a holistic nutritionist and a professional cancer coach. In today's episode, we are taking a look at a topic that lives in a very gray and often misunderstood zone of the wellness world, and that's intermittent fasting and eating disorders. For some people, fasting can be a strategic tool for metabolic health, blood sugar regulation, or simplicity around meals. But for others, especially those with a history of restriction, chronic dieting, or body image struggles, fasting can become a socially acceptable disguise for disordered eating. So how do we tell the difference? How do we navigate this? To help us unpack everything here and explain all these nuances, I'm joined today by my guest, Becky Mehr, a registered dietitian, eating disorder specialist, and one of the most respected voices at the intersection of nutrition, psychology, and compassionate care. Becky is Director of Outpatient Nutrition for the Renfrew Centers and serves as the registered dietitian at the Renfrew Center of Nashville. Ms. Mehr received her bachelor's degree in dietetics from Lipscomb University and her master's degree in clinical nutrition from the University of Memphis. Her presentations locally and nationally focus on the topics of exposure therapy, diabetes, and eating disorders. She is a member of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and the International Association of Eating Disorders Professionals and the Tennessee Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. This subject I don't feel is broached often enough, and I think it's something that needs to be brought out in the open. You know, sometimes we get caught up in these therapies and caught up in dieting, and we don't even realize some of the harm that we may be doing to ourselves. So just to have an open conversation about this, I think is an important thing for us to do. So please do stay tuned, and we will be back in just a few minutes to speak with Becky.
You are listening to Radio Maria Canada. We now continue with the program, The Health Hub, hosted by Cathy Biase.
Welcome back to the Health Hub. Please do follow us on our social sites. We are on Instagram, X, and Facebook, and we are at the Health Hub RMC on those locations. Becky, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking time to enlighten us about something you're very passionate about.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I am looking forward to this conversation about intermittent fasting and the intersection of eating disorders.
It is not often talked about, and you know we'll get to why it's the darling right now of the health space. But first of all, for listeners who may not know your background, or we didn't give them that much of a background in the introduction, can you share a bit about maybe your journey and what led you to work in the areas of eating disorder and nutrition, and then obviously intermittent fasting?
Yeah, so I started off as a pre-med major in college and was learning about the biology of plants and thought this is not really the direction into human nu not necessarily nutrition, but just understanding the human body and supporting um, people with medical concerns and issues, and took a nutrition course, and it just felt so natural and right. And so, of course, I made a pivot to nutrition in college. And then throughout that time, I also was very interested in the psychology of um, men just psychology and just the intersection of how eating disorders are not necessarily about food along the way, and realizing that somebody with an eating disorder, nutrition is a way of healing for them, and also working in the sphere of like what is going on with them, um, why is somebody using eating disorder behaviors and things like that. And so kind of like took a job in clinical nutrition, but always knew my passion was in the individual counseling with eating disorders and or more one-on-one of the whole well-being. And so landed in a job for with eating disorders and a higher level of care with Renfrew, and have been working in this field and with this population for probably close to 17 years at this point. And so it's been a great area of continued growth and development, and just learning more about um, the intersection of mental health and eating disorders and all the things that contribute.
It's amazing to me. I'm a nutritionist. It's amazing to me the mental aspect of eating. And I don't know, and this is just sort of something that's popped into my head. I don't know if it is true, but I conjecture that women have a lot more pensive moments when it comes to eating than men. Are you finding that in practice, or is that very wrong?
I do find that in practice, and that women are more pensive when it comes to eating. However, there is a lot of eating disorders in men that's on the rise.
Mm.
I think it is an under served population in the research, just because it is deemed potentially more of a female eating disorder. And there's a lot of more research in looking at women with eating disorders. However, men do struggle with eating disorders as well. I think there's a lot of stigma and bias around getting support, and so we don't see that as often. Um, yeah,
That to
it
me
is
is within the
present.
whole
Yeah.
mental health space in general.
Yes, yeah.
You know, it's more difficult for men to get the help that they need, maybe because they perceive themselves, or society perceives them as a stronger one, the quiet one that doesn't need the support. And I have with other guests, we've talked about this. There is a movement towards more support for men. So I think it's wonderful that within this space too, you are offering that out. And within the sort of the intermittent fasting buzzword kind of milieu. It's huge in the wellness space right now. But within the wellness space, you've got a lot of people that don't have the research background that you do and the practical background. So, how would you define intermittent fasting in a clinical term versus what we're seeing pushed online?
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of way to view it, of like what is being pushed on online versus what is the clinical view. So a clinical view of intermittent fasting is, setting specific intervals of time to eat or not eat, in an attempt to maybe improve health outcomes, meaning there is some research that shows those short-term benefits in helping with blood glucose, weight, blood pressure, cholesterol, chronic inflammation. However, the long-term effects aren't clear. And that's where I think the media and social um, presence kind of touts that, is that like, hey, if you do this for long term, you'll see all these results, but we really don't know the long-term effects of intermittent fasting. And it can show up in lots of different ways in the social media
Mm.
area that maybe isn't as evidence-based, or somebody's saying like, hey, here's how I did this, but it doesn't take into account maybe the medical components that the person is struggling with, or that individualization with that.
Well, what drew you to study this connection between intermittent fasting and disordered eating patterns?
Yeah. What drew me to it is just in clinical practice, seeing a lot of clients that, were, doing intermittent fasting or, um, struggling with restriction and kind of using that intermittent fasting um, knowledge or, what's the word? Not knowledge, but guys to kind of slide under the radar with maybe some disordered eating, but
Hmm.
also if somebody started out with intermittent fasting, um, how it sometimes developed into an eating disorder whenever they weren't really expecting it, in the sense that there's a lot of sometimes rigidity around that of like only eating within certain hours, or um, maybe they started seeing results and then kind of got more restrictive or rigid with
Hmm.
their behaviors around food. And so started seeing a little bit more of a our population with that intersection there.
So you've seen it from both sides: eating disorders, um, holding on to intermittent fasting, and then intermittent fasting turning people that may have a propensity for it. They then develop an eating disorder. So you've
Mhm.
seen both sides of the coin.
Yes, I've seen both sides of the coin where, yeah, the intermittent fasting kind of led to the eating disorder, or there was an eating disorder, and then the intermittent fasting kind of provide like catapulted the eating disorder
Hmm.
to something more severe and restrictive. So maybe from
Well,
disordered eating to a eating disorder at that point.
got it. And then, what would you say? You've worked with many people. Um, what would you say some of the maybe the early warning signs that the fasting protocol that one of the people that you're working with is no longer serving them and is instead maybe feeding this an eating disorder, or creating an eating disorder mindset?
Yeah, I think with that, what feeds the eating disorder mindset when somebody is using intermittent fasting is the strict rules around food, meaning that they can only eat during certain windows, which then leads to that social isolation or maybe a decreased quality of life. They may start to become irritable, or um, sometimes we see binge eating kind of occur, and
Mm-hmm.
that results in shame and guilt of like, why am I not strong enough to not like not eat during these times? Or, maybe having a snack because they're listening to their body cues. And then there's a lot of, during that time of fasting, and then there's a lot of guilt and shame around that because it's like, why am I not? Again, that message of like, I'm not strong enough to do this, or my body's failing me a little bit. Um, and so, kind of seeing that, those are kind of some of those warning signs that I think that there's a lot more happening for the person, um, and that it could lead to the eating disorder there of how rigid they are around that, rather than being flexible.
In general, do you think that intermittent fasting, and I know we have to kind of go over the different approaches to intermittent fasting, but in general, do you think this is a safe way to lose weight? Or, as you kind of alluded to before, is intermittent fasting maybe more for something therapeutic?
I, I mean, I think if somebody is going to do intermittent fasting from a therapeutic standpoint, it needs to be monitored by a medical doctor, working with a dietitian, maybe even working with a therapist, and to also proceed with extreme caution, or maybe find an alternative for whatever medical concern they are looking to address through intermittent fasting, because it is such a slippery slope.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's also not providing sometimes the body the nourishment that it needs throughout the day with intermittent fasting, depending on how it's done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about and there has been a trend towards more exercising, again, on social media. They've really pushed, strength training, and it's something that I love. But when you're becoming more active, and you're still combining, we have fasting exercise protocols and everything like that. And you can get any question that you answer, that you pose on social media can give you the answer that you're kind of looking for, so to speak. What is your sort of, if you're talking to somebody who is pretty athletic, is working out, trying to put this intermittent fasting into place as well, how do you approach them with respect to the calories needed for your body to keep up with the demands on it? Do you find that crossing that line with some people is a little bit difficult?
Yeah, I think it is hard whenever somebody is when you're providing the education around somebody that is using intermittent fasting and also exercising in the sense of they're wanting to build muscle or build strength and providing the gentle education around truly what their body needs, how the intermittent fasting regimen could set them up for eating disorder behaviors, meaning maybe more restriction, maybe binging because they're not fueling their body properly or adequately, but also how it may actually diminish the muscle that they're trying to build because they're underfeeding their body, potentially, depending on how they're going about how they're meeting their needs in that time.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be very hard to have that conversation. And so I think it's meeting them with compassion and empathy around what's going on in the bigger picture for them, and then figuring out how to provide that education and support with them to them.
Well, let's go back a little bit to kind of defining intermittent fasting. There are many or several different approaches to intermittent fasting under this umbrella. Can you give me the big ones?
Yeah, usually some of the big ones are fasting for 16 hours and only eating for 8 hours. And so there's a lot of timestamps around the intermittent fasting are some of the big ones, or some of the ways of intermittent fasting that have shown up are um, fasting for a set amount of days, whether that's 2 or 3, which again is not recommended for health, is to avoid nutrition. Um, and then on the other 5 days, eating a typical amount of calories. Or there's alternate day fasting, which is eating a typical diet one day and then only about 25% of nutritional needs the next day. And so, again, whenever we start seeing these intermittent fasting things, there is an appeal to it because it provides some structure or around maybe eating, but again, it will sometimes, and we have research that shows that it can lead to increased restriction or binging, or even cycling in the sense of increasing guilt and shame. And then it's like, we can't follow this and it's not sustainable,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is that slippery slope to, um, disordered eating or eating disorder or other health issues popping up, meaning low blood sugar or things like that from the stint of fasting, that can leave your body shaking, irritable, lethargic, all those different components happening.
Now, when you're working with people, are you working with individuals that have that are in this situation that have tried intermittent fasting and it's turned rogue for them, or are you sort of a broad-based therapist talking to people about how to eat properly to structure their day?
Within Renfrew's high level care, we do see both of those,
Mm-hmm.
where somebody has done intermittent fasting and it's gone rogue in the sense of, they're coming in and saying, like, I can't continue to not eat during the day, and that's resulting in binging in the evening, or there's a lot of lab work that is off because of the um, results of the intermittent fasting that has impacted their health. And then also, again, from a broad spectrum of nutrition, of helping to provide the education of why some of these um, diets or the appeal of diet or food and wellness in culture and social media, how it's not really individualized as moving us away
Mm-hmm.
from our individual cues and reducing the flexibility around food and things like that. And so from a broad lens, but then also working with clients that have come in that have done intermittent fasting and it's gone rogue for them.
You brought up something there that I think is, well, I don't ever hear it talked about when we're talking about intermittent fasting is the cues, our hunger cues, our satiation cues. And you also talked about lab work. So two different questions, but kind of the same. What lab work are you looking at as maybe a directive to show your clients and patients that things are not going well? And then alternatively, do you speak to them about looking in towards their body and then the body cues? I guess we'll take that as two separate questions. Let's start with a lab work one. What lab work are you looking at to kind of give you an indication and to share with your patients and clients that this is not healthy for them?
Yeah, it for the lab work, it's really looking at the comprehensive metabolic panel and potentially their not lever, their cholesterol levels. And sometimes their liver enzymes can be elevated. And so when we see somebody who is not meeting nutritional needs, we sometimes will see a low blood glucose. We may see phosphorus and potassium in a abnormal range. And then again, depending on how depleted their body is of nutritional stores and or fuel, we sometimes see that impact their kidney function and liver function, depending on how long that's been going. So again, that's kind of the misnomer is like, yes, there is sometimes evidence that shows that intermittent fasting can help with some medical
Mm-hmm.
conditions, but it needs to be, if somebody's doing that, monitored and regular lab work to make sure there's not more things happening or showing up.
Who's qualified to work with people? Okay, what are the instances where you are on board with intermittent fasting, and who is qualified to work with somebody who you want to see on intermittent fasting for therapeutic reasons?
Yeah, I think that's a bit more nuanced. And so it's really working with the medical provider or the
Mm-hmm.
doctor around what is it that you're seeing and can we possibly try other routes as opposed to maybe intermittent fasting to help with the medical concerns that are showing up or whatever the client is kind of looking for. So again, it's really that individualized approach, but I think it takes a team of sometimes a therapist, depending on um, what shows up, a medical provider to really be able to run the lab work and interpret them, and then a dietitian that is really aware of, you know, the emotional work that may be there,
Mm-hmm.
hunger and fullness cues, like really being able to work with clients on those interoceptive cues um, with that.
And so, in your estimation, and from your professional point of view, are there situations where intermittent fasting is beneficial?
It I don't know if I would say it is. I think from a professional lens, we do fast whenever we're sleeping. And so I think that that is the most
Mm-hmm.
beneficial of whenever we are um, at times of rest between meals. That's when our body is naturally doing that. And intermittent fasting kind of shifts our internal and interoceptive cues and helps and sometimes deters us from being able to recognize when our body is physically hungry and or not respond to that. It's kind of like telling somebody if they need to go to the bathroom, like we need to wait whenever our body is telling us it's hungry. It seems counterintuitive to say, hey, we're not going to nourish it in this moment. And so I do, yeah.
And so then when you have someone sitting in front of you and they're questioning their eating patterns and you're trying to dictate to them what you would consider as a healthy eating pattern, where do you start?
Could you repeat the question? I got the last part of the
The
healthy
Yeah,
eating.
if someone was sitting in front of you and you were even a carte blanche, Give us an idea of what you feel is a healthy eating pattern.
Yeah, I think the healthy eating pattern is finding a balanced, individualized approach where we are honoring, or the person is honoring their internal cues or those interoceptive cues of whenever
Mm-hmm.
they're hungry, whenever they're full, whatever foods they may be craving and having those foods versus avoiding those. Um, Maintaining flexibility around food, meaning when food's available, what food is available, and being able to have a wide, varied diet and relationship with food. I think it's also um, not having, I mean, there is some stress when you go out to eat or there's social eating, but just having the freedom and the ability instead of isolating or not doing those opportunities to go and eat socially. Um, yeah, but being able to sit with sit with a meal and converse with friends and not be so preoccupied in your head around like what's happening or going on or needing to compensate later or thinking it's outside the window of eating if we're talking about in the context of intermittent fasting, kind of influencing that, but really having that balanced, individualized approach that honors our internal cues of hunger and fullness.
Perfect. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Okay, we're going to take a quick break here, and we'll be back in just a few minutes to continue this conversation with Becky.
You are listening to The Health Hub here on Radio Maria Canada, a Catholic voice wherever you are. To contact us and be a part of the show, email thh@radiomaria.ca. We now continue with the program. Here once again is your host, Cathy Biase.
Welcome back to the Health Hub. My guest today is Becky Mehr. We're going to continue on this conversation about intermittent fasting and really what we're doing here, what Becky is doing here, and what her work is about, is showing you the other side of intermittent fasting in all of its pieces. She went over already the types of intermittent fasting, but it's important for you to see the other side of things. So, Becky, when we're on social media, and I'm just a scroller like everybody else. I see, and I do my research, but there are just so many, basic, air quotes headlines about the potential benefits of intermittent fasting. Is there science in the other direction, which is stating this could be maybe a gateway to eating disorders, or this may not be the best way to approach our nutrition?
Yeah, there are. I mean, I think with science and research, there's always two sides to the coin, meaning you're going to see all these things, and social media will also direct you to those things that kind of back up what you've already been looking at. But there is the other side to this, and that there's a lot of emerging research on this because I think intermittent fasting has had a resurgent of popularity in social media and in the medical world. And so we're starting to see a lot more studies that kind of go the other route. There is one from 2003 that found that if somebody had participated in intermittent fasting in the past 12 months, that there was associated with all eating disorder behaviors, such as overeating, binge eating, vomiting, laxative use, compulsive exercise, and fasting. So again, we're starting to see, the research showing that intermittent fasting can lead to disordered eating or eating disorder patterns. With that just because of the restrictive nature in that.
So obviously, you do not recommend trying this on your own. You are a practitioner who believes that anybody who wants to go on some type of a fasting protocol needs to be watched.
Yeah, I think they need to be watched and exploring why it is that they're looking for that as their means of medical support or means of intervention for whatever's happening. Because again, social media, I think, has been highlighting this as a way to improve health. And we're seeing a lot of the pictures that kind of reinforce this, but I don't think social media tells the whole story. And so I do think somebody needs to be monitored and or potentially avoid it if at all possible. And so that's where that support comes in.
Do you have any recommendations to help people discern good information from bad information,
There,
especially on social media?
yeah, I think to discern the information, um, it's really looking at both sides of the research. I know a lot of times people aren't seeing this, but it is, looking at the research articles and determining how many people were in the study. I mean, if it's a study of five, that's not really giving you a big picture or a broad spectrum of like how this can impact overall health and well-being. Sometimes the studies are very um, uh, I don't want to say curated, but curated comes to mind of just,
Hmm.
a doctor or a practitioner, somebody in research was like, oh, we found this um, correlation, but it may not be the end all be all causation of things. And so I think it's really looking at maybe the research in general, which is boring. Nobody wants to do that. So again, they're looking at the headlines and kind of following those and curating their own beliefs and their own structure around eating, which can really impact their overall health and well-being and that relationship with food. Um, so I'd really throw caution of somebody wanting to do intermittent fasting and really want them to have a conversation with support around what it is that they're looking for, if there's
Hmm.
other things that they've tried, like what's really going on, and again, touching on some of the psychology of that before just kind of going off on their own to do it.
And basically for most of us, it's just trying one of the methods, the
Hmm.
16-hour window or the not eating for 2 days, that sort of thing. And I've tried each and every one of them. I don't find any of them easy. I think the easiest one probably is just eating in a window of time. And in that respect, I I see some validity if the eating window is not too restrictive, or if people can understand that sometimes, you can open the window a little bit. And here's where my thought process goes, and that's down the circadian rhythm pathway, and eating the way your body wants you to eat. And generally, that is eating within a window because you're sleeping for a long period of time. But the other piece, and maybe you can tell me I'm wrong, is that not eating for a couple of hours before bed can be very helpful for sleep. Now, within this argument, where do you lie?
Yeah. When we talk about kind of that circadian rhythm around things and behavior, like eating and patterns and things like that,
Hmm.
there is, a lot of scientific research that shows that eating, not eating prior to bed helps to reduce sometimes gastric reflux if that's present. Um, I don't know if there's a lot of research that shows that there's a certain time to stop eating before bed because
Hmm.
it's really following that circadian rhythm around like knowing like when you're hungry and when you're full. It's also really hard to sleep if you're hungry. I
Right.
think that your sleep is disturbed. So again, it's really following and really learning those cues and honoring those. Um,
It's getting back to the cues of the body, right?
yeah.
I know, and this is where for me, when I'm talking to people and this topic comes up, I'm most comfortable talking about eating within your rhythm of the day. Now, obviously, everybody doesn't work from 8 till 4 or 9 to 5. Some people are on shift work, and you're absolutely right. You need to eat enough calories so that when you go to sleep, you're not just sleeping, right? You're burning calories, and you need enough calories during the day to support the work that's going on at night. But a circadian rhythm to me, and you can again tell me I'm wrong about this. If you're understanding your own circadian rhythm, you're actually moving back into understanding the cues of your body. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think if you're working within the hours that you're awake, honoring when your body is hungry, whenever it's full. It's um, more nuanced, like having a varied diet. You are kind of getting back into that like rhythm that will hopefully help overall health and mood because you're hopefully sleeping better. Um, yeah, and energy levels are stable throughout the day if you're doing that. And yeah.
Now, for someone, I'm sure you work with a lot of people, and I'm curious, for someone who is, recovering from an eating disorder, whether initiated by an extreme fasting or prior to it, how do they begin to explore trusting their bodies? What questions should they be asking themselves as they recover, or, if they feel again drawn to the fasting? How do you work with people that are trying to break this cycle?
Yeah, I think in working with somebody that's trying to break this cycle, it's really helping them to take their eating patterns from something that feels maybe chaotic internally and or externally to them to something that feels more structured. And so a lot of times it is working with them on having regular meals within regular times. Um, I say regular times, knowing that people may work in different shifts and things like that, but what makes sense for how their day-to-day functioning is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then making sure that they are having adequate fuel during those times. And so a lot of times it is helping to set up structured eating around timing of meals and the amount of food that maybe is present in those moments before they can really start to develop the cues. Because if we think about somebody or even somebody that's in recovery or working on recovery that has a past of not honoring those cues, eventually the body stops telling you that you're hungry because it's not getting a response. And so what we find is that structured eating um, and regular intervals helps to have the body kind of find its own rhythm and path into that and recognizing that like, oh, I'm getting consistent nutrition. So if I turn on my hunger cue, I will probably get a response back and have fuel provided at that moment.
Mm-hmm. So it's getting the brain to trust the body and the body
Mhm.
to trust the brain is where we're at. This is in a lot of different medical spaces as well.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah.
just within nutrition. Anybody that has had a shock, a life shock, a health issue, PTSD is, trying to get beyond the fear of, and it's very hard to work with. I'm doing it myself, trying to work with this. Getting your body in sync is not easy. It is not easy at all. Honestly, it feels like sometimes your body is in this hyper stressed mode because it's afraid of which way things are going to go.
Mhm.
So, beyond the actual patterning of eating, are there other supportive practices that you would initiate or that you've heard of? They may not be your field, but anything psychological or spiritual that help to foster a healthy relationship with food for your clients and patients?
Yeah, I think what is helpful and in working with Renfrew is really looking at the emotional side of things, meaning that a lot of times we find ways to cope from uncomfortable emotions, whether that's happiness, sadness, anger, frustration, um, joy, those different things, that there are physical sensations that go along with those, and also behaviors that we maybe engage in because we feel uncomfortable with those emotions. So it's really
Mm-hmm.
doing the emotional work around identifying what are our physical sensations, what are the thoughts that are linked to that that um, take our attention or our focus away from, our friends or eating or those different areas and kind of helping to untangle those. And so it's recognizing that like I can feel joy and sit here and um, be okay with that. I don't have to do anything to like suppress joy, which is kind of odd to talk about suppressing joy, but a lot of people feel very uncomfortable with joy depending on their background and the things that they've encountered in their life. It just they don't feel comfortable with that. So it's
Hmm.
really working on that intersection as well. Um,
Well, do you, okay, as beyond the practitioner that you are sitting in front and trying to work out a schedule with people and on that, how do you define nourishment? Like, is it beyond calories and the macros? When you're speaking with someone and you this idea of nourishing the body, do you have a broader sense of the word?
Yeah, I do have a broader sense of nourishment or fueling the body. It's to me, it's having joy whenever you're eating foods that you like and bring um, satisfaction. And also at times it can be eating to just nourish your body in the moments of stress or um, whenever your work schedule may be so structured or back to back that you may have to just find the window that works to eat and eat, but it is, nourishing your body, also nourishing your mind,
Hmm.
and um, yeah, nourishing the relationships you have. And so it kind of trickles into every aspect, but it's really helping to find balance in your life overall and in eating.
Hmm. Excellent. And if you could shift maybe one mainstream, like a mindset or a mainstream belief, if you could shift one of those beliefs of intermittent fasting, what would it be?
It would be, ah, that's a tough question. I'm trying to think. Um, I
Would
think
you
the
just
belief,
like the reasoning behind it? That I mean that's kind of where I'm going. Like
yeah,
intermittent fasting gives us the one side of,
yeah.
I mean, the social media often just gives us the one side. I've
Mhm.
not seen many things on social media to the negative speak of intermittent fasting. So where
Yeah.
would you push that sort of an idea? How would you make people maybe stand back and say, maybe I should consider this a little bit more thoughtfully? How would you do that?
Yeah, I think I would work with them around kind of recognizing maybe the long-term effects that aren't as clear, um, especially with those with a history of disordered eating, teens or others drawn to those rigid food rules, um, and kind of helping them to kind of understand like there might be something else to focus on, meaning intuitive eating, gentle nutrition, building trust with their body. Um, and also to kind of look at the other side of things too, see if, because I know with social media, you can kind of, you curate your social media presence. And so it could be like searching out social media pieces that provide the other side of that could be helpful as well.
Is it hard to? I have seen a lot more publicity about intuitive eating. Is that a hard thing to accomplish?
I I think it's harder than what social media makes it out to be, because a lot of times it is touted as like eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full. But
Hmm.
there are 11 tenets or principles behind intuitive eating, and those are just two of the 11. And so I do think it is something that is achievable and able to find that grounding for somebody, but it does take a lot of work and building trust with their body and kind of recognizing like I can have certain foods that maybe social media has deemed off limits or to pound the intermittent fasting regimen that like you know that you're
Hmm.
doing um, being able to honor the cues. So I do think that within social media there's a lot of um, guilt and shame that shows up with not following the rules or those different things, where intuitive eating is, again, more intuitive. And so I think people struggle with that. But it is achievable. And a lot of people do work on that and move into that intuitive eating realm.
We're talking a lot here about self-compassion, aren't we? Looking
Yeah.
at yourself and giving yourself a break, and that too is not easily done. I'm going to assume that this component comes into when you're working with people that have eating disorders.
Yes, it's again giving yourself compassion. I know you asked about like nourishing yourself, and I think that that's another component of kind of nourishing yourself is being able to have compassion for yourself, being able to listen to your body whenever it's telling you something. Yeah, and having that. Yeah,
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard
yeah,
for many of us. to
Mm-hmm.
venture into that space of self-compassion. This is wonderful, and I think it's really great to be able to see the other side of the coin. I think when there's the big push in one direction, you always have to have a little bit on the other side to kind of balance things off. And I think with what you've talked about today and what we've presented, it gives people maybe a moment to pause and to think before they, venture off into something that they may not completely understand. And if people had further questions, people that are listening, where could they learn more about your work? Do you have online resources? Do you work remotely with people? Can you tell us about that part of your practice?
Yeah, so my practice is with the Renfrew Center. So we are a higher level of care eating disorder treatment center. And so I do see individuals through that program but I'm also, there's resources within our blog post around some more takeaways for intermittent fasting, the intersection of eating disorders. And yeah, I'm trying to think if there's another resource off the top of my head that I can think of, but those are the two that I can think of. So I don't have an individual practice. So.
Okay. Well, all that will be listed in the show notes for sure. Becky, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation.
All right. Thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation as well.
And if there's any questions that you have for Becky, I do encourage you to reach out. This is a very difficult topic for some people, and it's so strongly promoted in some areas that you really do need to make sure if it is right for you. So again, Becky, thank you for the information. Thank you for the resources, and everybody, will talk to you next week on the Health Hub.
You have been listening to The Health Hub, hosted by Cathy Biase, here on Radio Maria Canada.